When you think of areas that produce giant whitetails, states like Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and Kansas all come to mind. The Midwest is the epicenter for big deer, and everyone that wants a chance at a once-in-a-lifetime buck flocks to these states year after year. Now, just because you hunt in a state that is not in the Midwest doesn't mean that you won't ever see a world-class whitetail in your neck of the woods. States like Pennsylvania, Arkansas, Montana, Maine, and even Washington State all have deer in the record books over 200 inches. Big bucks are out there all across the United States. Some states just have more than others. One particular state that isn't very well known for big deer produced one of the most eye-catching, world-class whitetails that any hunter in any state would be more than happy with shooting.
This is the biggest deer on the whole East Coast. From Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Maine, clear down through New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, clear down through to Florida. This is the Bill Crutchfield buck. Come out of Maryland, about 30 miles from Washington, D.C. They called it the marsh monster. It was in the marsh over there. Anyhow, Bill harvested this deer. It's 268 and 2/8, I believe. Giant, typical frame, and literally everything straight in the air. It's got pretty much anything that you or I think anybody else that whitetail hunts would say, yeah, that's the deer there. He's a tremendous whitetail. And Bill stood on an island, basically, just swamp everywhere, and shot this deer at like 80 or 100 yards open sights with a shotgun. And I can't imagine he'd seen the deer for hours and hours and hours and finally was able to harvest it.
It seems like whitetails oftentimes have a knack for making us wait. In this case, Bill had to wait almost 2 years for a chance at this marsh monster. In February of 2005, Bill was shed hunting a farm that he hunts along the Potomac River and stumbled across a giant shed not even 100 yards away from his river stand. He knew right away that this buck was special and that someone would get a shot at him in that stand. Later in the year, Bill climbed into that same stand on the river where he had found the giant shed on the rainy opening day of Maryland's gun season in November of 2005. Not even an hour into the hunt, Bill heard something behind him and turned around to see the marsh monster 125 yards away walking through the reeds. After a few minutes, the buck bedded down in the only high spot in the marsh, only getting up to shake off the rain every hour or so. Bill stood like a statue all day in the stand, watching and waiting for the buck to stand up, but it never happened. Bill climbed out of his stand after last light, not knowing if the buck was still there, and made his way back home for the evening. Bill and his friends spent the rest of the opening weekend hunting around that same farm, but with no luck spotting the giant whitetail. The season came and went, and Bill found himself in the same situation the very next year. After 2 days of hunting, Bill decided to go back to that stand where he had encountered the giant the previous year. An hour into the hunt, the giant showed up again and bedded almost right where he was bedded the previous season. Bill stood there waiting for his opportunity, and finally 2 hours into the wait, it came. Another buck came down the same path and walked right by the bedded buck, this one an 8-pointer with a really wide spread that Bill said he would have shot any other day but that day. As the buck passed by, the giant got out of his bed and presented Bill with a 100-yard shot. Bill squeezed the trigger and watched as the deer went crashing through the marsh grass. The buck ended up only running 40 yards before he crashed, and Bill recalls walking up to the animal in disbelief at how big the buck truly was. The buck itself has 28 scoreable points and was green scored by the deputy chief of the Maryland DNR at 268 and 5/8 inches, a full 40 inches higher than the state record at that time. After the 60-day drying period, Bill had the world-class rack officially scored by Boone & Crockett at 268 and 1/8 inches. The buck is still the Maryland state record and officially sits at the Boone & Crockett number 22 all-time non-typical ever taken, as well as the biggest buck ever taken on the East Coast.